Welcome to part 2 of digital design, clocks and registers. This will be session 1, the D flop. We ended the previous part of digital basics with a brief introduction to latches and time-based waveforms. For example, our out signal might be used to turn on a light. But what if during the on time we would like this light to blink on and off? What we would like is for our logic to create another signal like this light enable that toggles up and down during the latched on period and that we can use to turn on our blinking light. These are the external signals, the ones given to us, and these are the internal signals, the ones we create with our logic. Clearly, we need some way to differentiate these points in time, to establish states for spans of time. The first step in tagging spans of time is the concept of logic clocks. These are not tiny digital watches that tell us the current time, but they serve a similar function in that they do keep track of time in a sense, and, like a watch, can keep us on a predefined schedule of events. But what exactly is a logic clock? A logic clock is simply a signal that toggles up and down at a very regular rate. In fact, usually at a frequency that's accurate to within a few parts per million. Each rising edge of this clock signal is used to define a new state of the associated logic operation, and looks perhaps to be just the ticket for our light toggler. Here, a clock signal named cleverly clock sig steps a logic-based counter along whose output signal count state transitions each clock signal rising edge. At this point, of course, we have no idea what a logic counter is or how it works, but we will eventually understand. First, though, we must begin with a fundamental clocked building block, the register. And in our case, a specific type of register called a D flip-flop. A D flop has an input labeled D, an output labeled Q, and a clock input, which we universally show with this symbol. A D flip-flop consists of a bunch of basic logic gates, but we will not dive into that room here, since in the modern world of digital design, nobody actually builds flip-flops from gates anymore, not any more than anybody has built up logic gates with transistors in the last 50 years. Let's take a look at how a D flop works. Say we have an input to the register flip-flop that we'll call sig in, and an output named sig out. Our clock is clock sig. Now if sig in goes high here, this clock rising edge misses the high going sig in, but this one catches it. And the register output, sig out, now goes high, following the input signal. Here's the point. The flip-flop samples the input only at each clock rising edge, but then stores it. It holds on to that level. So, even if the input goes back low, the output of the flip-flop stays high, In this sense, a register is a type of memory. It remembers what the state was at the last clock edge. Not until the next rising clock edge does the output follow the input. In fact, the input could go high and back low, and if it is not caught by a clock edge, the output never goes high again. The input change isn't seen by the register flip-flop. Now, though, it's time to introduce an important feature of clocked registers, the concept of clocked delays, of shifting data in time. We'll start with this input waveform for the input sig-in. And we now understand that the D-flop picks up the highs and lows on the next rising clock edge. Now we'll add another D flip-flop register whose input is the first flop's output, sig-out. We'll call this second flop's output sig-out D1. And now the question is, what does it look like? Let's zoom in on one of sig-out's transitions at a clock edge. Viewing this through our time microscope, we find that the D flip-flop's output does not transition instantaneously. In the real world, it takes a little bit of time for it to react. We're talking nanoseconds here, billionths of a second, but that is enough that the second D-flop misses catching the transition. The second D-flop will need to wait for the next clock edge to react. So, to answer the original question, sig-out D1 is delayed by one full clock period from sig-out. It's the same, just shifted in time. In fact, I chose the D1 ending to remind us that this signal is sig-out delayed by one clock. Next, we'll look at a very simple arrangement using a D flip-flop where we feed the output back to the input but inverted. Let's see what the flop's output looks like. We'll begin with the output toggle low, which means that the input is high. Thus, on the next rising clock edge, the output goes high and the input low. You can see what's going to happen. Each clock edge, the output is going to change state, and you can see why we called the output what we did. The result is a square wave that's half the frequency of the clock. Now we'll add another signal that I'll call flash enable. You might be getting an idea where this is going. We'll gate the toggle flop's output with this new signal and call the result light enable, and add that to our waveform. We've created a signal that goes active 3 times, equally spaced. I'm sure by now you know what comes next. What if we use this gated signal, light enable, to, well, enable a light? Voila! Of course, this is only practical if the clock signal is unnaturally very, very slow. But you get the idea. And here's your exercises for session 1. As always, you can find the answers at the beginning of session 2.